10 true paranormal stories that could rival The Conjuring. The world is full of mysteries, but some stories stand out for their sheer terror. Accounts so chilling, they rival even the scariest Hollywood films. These aren't fictional tales. These are real-life experiences from people who swear they've encountered the paranormal. From haunted houses to unexplainable encounters, these are The Whispering Walls. My name is Angela Parker, and when I was 16, my family moved into a sprawling Victorian home in upstate New York. It was beautiful, but old, with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and a strange, unsettling atmosphere. From the moment we moved in, things felt off. At first, it was little things, the creak of footsteps on empty floors, or the faint sound of wind when all the windows were shut. But soon, we began to hear whispering, soft and low, coming from the walls. My parents insisted it was just the house settling, or drafts moving through the old pipes. But the whispers didn't sound random. They sounded purposeful, like people talking in hushed tones just out of earshot. Late at night, I'd press my ear to the wall, trying to make out the words, but they were always too faint, like a secret I wasn't meant to hear. One night, I woke up to find my younger sister, Emily, standing at the foot of my bed. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling. "They're in the walls," she whispered, pointing toward the corner of my room. I froze as a chill ran down my spine. Together, we sat in silence, listening to the murmurs. They seemed to move, growing louder as if circling us. I wanted to scream, but fear kept me silent. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. The whispers became louder and more distinct, moving from room to room. Sometimes it sounded like arguing. Other times, it was like a chorus of voices, too many to count. My dad, a skeptic, began hearing them too, though he refused to admit it for weeks. One night, he told my mom he'd heard the whispers in the living room while everyone else was asleep. The breaking point came one evening when Emily ran screaming from her room. She swore she'd seen a shadowy figure emerge from the wall and stand by her bed, its features obscured, but its presence unmistakable. We tried to convince her it was a nightmare, but deep down, we all knew it wasn't. That night, my parents decided we had to leave. We packed our bags and moved into a friend's house until we could sell the property. The whispers didn't follow us, but I could never shake the feeling that they were still there, in the house, waiting for someone else to hear their secrets. The new owners claimed they never experienced anything unusual, but I can't help but wonder if the house was waiting for us, or if we had unknowingly disturbed something that had been there all along. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night to the memory of those voices, soft and persistent, calling from behind the walls. The Man in the Mirror. When I was 15, my family inherited an antique mirror from my great-grandmother. It was enormous, with an ornate golden frame that seemed to shimmer even in low light. My mother loved it and placed it in the living room as a centerpiece. I, however, hated it from the start. There was something about it that felt wrong, as though it was watching me. At first, it was just little things. I'd glance at the mirror and think I saw movement behind me, but when I turned around, the room was empty. Other times, I'd catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye and feel like it didn't move in sync with me, but I always told myself it was just my imagination. Things got worse one night when I was home alone. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I felt the air in the room grow heavy, almost electric. I glanced up at the mirror and froze. There was a man standing behind me. He was tall, wearing a dark suit, and his face was obscured in shadow. I whipped around, but no one was there. My heart was pounding as I turned back to the mirror, and the man was gone. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. I avoided the mirror after that, refusing to even glance at it when I walked through the room. My younger brother, Liam, didn't believe me, and teased me about being scared. But one day, even he went quiet after walking by the mirror. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head and muttered, "I thought I saw something." The worst night came when my friend Sarah stayed over. We were watching a movie in the living room when she suddenly screamed, dropping her drink. I turned to her, startled, and she pointed at the mirror, her face pale. "There's someone in the mirror," she cried. I looked, and there he was again, the man in the dark suit, his hollow eyes staring out at us. This time, we both ran upstairs and locked ourselves in my room, refusing to go back down until my parents came home. My parents didn't believe us, of course. They said it was just an old mirror, but I begged my mum to get rid of it. She finally agreed after my brother admitted that he had seen the man too, standing perfectly still in the reflection one night when he was walking to the kitchen. The mirror was sold at an auction shortly after that, and I felt an immense sense of relief when it was gone. But to this day, I avoid antique mirrors. Every time I pass one, I can't help but glance into the reflection, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing behind me, waiting for me to notice him again. The Haunted Doll. When I was 8, my grandmother gave me a porcelain doll she had owned since her childhood. The doll was delicate, with glassy blue eyes and a tiny, perfect smile, dressed in an old-fashioned lace gown. At first I loved it, proud of the connection to my grandmother. But as time passed, I started to feel uneasy around it, though I couldn't explain why. I placed the doll on a shelf in my bedroom, where it sat facing my bed. Every night, I would lie in bed, feeling as if its unblinking eyes were watching me. One night, I woke up to the sound of faint giggling. At first, I thought it was my sister, but when I turned on the light, I saw the doll, no longer on the shelf, but sitting upright on my desk. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself I must have moved it earlier and forgotten. The next morning, I put the doll back on the shelf, making sure it was secure. That night, I woke again, this time to a loud thud. The doll was on the floor, lying face up, its glassy eyes staring at the ceiling. I picked it up, placed it back, and told my parents what had happened. They brushed it off as my imagination or an accidental knock. Things escalated over the next few days. The doll began appearing in different parts of the room, on my windowsill, on my nightstand, even in my closet. I knew I wasn't moving it, but my parents still didn't believe me. They only started taking it seriously when my dad saw it happen. He was helping me clean my room when the doll, which had been sitting securely on the shelf, suddenly tipped forward and landed several feet away, as though it had been thrown. That night, we all heard the giggling. It came from my room, faint and high-pitched, almost childlike. My mum went pale and told my dad to get rid of the doll immediately. He buried it in the backyard the next day, saying it was just an old toy and we were overreacting, but I could tell he was unnerved too. For a while, the house was quiet, and I started to feel safe again. But every now and then, especially on windy nights, I could swear I heard faint giggling coming from the direction of the garden. My grandmother never mentioned the doll again, and neither did we. To this day, I avoid porcelain dolls entirely. I'll never forget the way it seemed to move on its own, as if it had a mind and a purpose of its own. The shadow in the hallway. When I moved into my first apartment, I was thrilled to finally have a space of my own. It was small but cozy, with a long hallway that led from the living room to the bedroom. At first, everything was perfect, but then I started noticing something strange. At night, when the lights were off, I'd catch glimpses of a shadow at the end of the hallway, just out of the corner of my eye. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, or the way the light from the street lamps filtered through the curtains. But as time went on, the shadow seemed to grow darker, more distinct. It didn't move, but it was always there, standing at the edge of the hall, watching. I started to feel uneasy in my own home, especially at night. One evening, I was watching TV when my cat, Luna, suddenly stopped playing and stared down the hallway. Her fur bristled, and she hissed, something she had never done before. I turned to look, and for a split second, I thought I saw the shadow step closer. I froze, gripping the armrest of the couch, and when I blinked, it was gone. I told my best friend Mia about it, and she laughed, saying I was just letting my imagination run wild. She offered to stay over one night to prove nothing was there. That night, as we sat talking in the living room, she stopped mid-sentence and stared at the hallway. Her face went pale. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I didn't have to ask what she meant. The shadow was back, darker than ever, standing halfway down the hall. Mia grabbed her coat and left, refusing to stay another minute. After that, I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. The shadow would still appear, darker than the lit hallway around it, and I couldn't shake the feeling it was getting closer each time. The final straw came one night when I woke up to the sound of something tapping lightly on my bedroom door. I stayed frozen in bed, too terrified to move, as the tapping continued. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the hallway was empty, but I could feel it. The air was heavy, and the shadow lingered, unseen but present. I moved out a week later, leaving behind the apartment and the unease that came with it. To this day, I still feel a chill when I walk down long hallways, afraid that if I look back, I might see that shadow waiting for me again. The poltergeist in the basement. My name is Eric Thompson, and as a kid, I was terrified of our basement. It was dark, damp, and always colder than the rest of the house, even in the middle of summer. My parents used to send me down there to grab tools or storage items, and every time I'd go, I'd feel like I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a sense of unease, but soon, things started happening that I couldn't explain. One afternoon, I was helping my dad organize his workbench when I heard soft footsteps behind me. Thinking it was my mom, I turned around, but no one was there. I brushed it off until a few minutes later, when the footsteps came again, this time louder, like someone walking directly up to me. My dad must have noticed my face because he asked what was wrong. I told him what I heard, but he just laughed and said, "It's probably the house settling." A few weeks later, I was alone in the basement, looking for a screwdriver, when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty space. I called out, thinking maybe my mom or dad had come down, but there was no answer. As I turned back to the workbench, a hammer that had been lying flat suddenly slid across the table and fell to the floor with a loud clang. I ran upstairs as fast as I could, leaving the lights on and the door open behind me. The activity escalated from there. Tools would disappear and reappear in strange places, and lights would flicker even when the rest of the house was fine. One night, while my dad was fixing something in the basement, he swore he saw a shadow move across the room. He didn't mention it at first, but I overheard him telling my mom later that night. She brushed it off, but I could tell he was rattled. The scariest incident happened on a stormy night. I was in my room when I heard a loud crash coming from the basement. My dad and I ran down to investigate, and we found his workbench completely overturned, tools scattered everywhere. There was no logical explanation for how it could have happened. My dad quietly muttered, "We need to get someone to look at this." A few days later, a priest came to bless the basement. For a while, things calmed down, but the feeling of being watched never really went away. We eventually moved out of that house, and I haven't been back since. But even now, I can't stand basements. Whenever I'm in one, I can't help but listen for those slow, deliberate footsteps. The Phantom Touch. When I was 22, I rented a room in an old farmhouse while attending college. The house was charming, but had an eerie stillness, especially at night. My landlord, Mrs. Grayson, was kind, but avoided talking about the house's history. I chalked it up to the quirks of living in an old building until I started experiencing the phantom touch. It began as subtle things. At night, while lying in bed, I'd feel a faint brush against my arm or a tug at the blanket. I assumed it was the drafty windows or my imagination, but the sensations grew stronger. One evening, while I was studying at my desk, I felt a distinct pressure on my shoulder, like someone placing a hand there. I spun around, expecting to see Mrs. Grayson, but the room was empty. The most unsettling experience happened a few weeks later. I woke up in the middle of the night to the feeling of fingers running through my hair. My heart raced as I sat up, but the room was silent, the air unnaturally cold. I turned on the light and scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I asked Mrs. Grayson if she'd ever noticed anything strange about the house. She hesitated before finally admitting, "You've probably met Mary." When I asked who Mary was, she explained that the house had once belonged to a young woman named Mary, who had died in her sleep decades ago. Mrs. Grayson believed Mary's spirit still lingered, but she insisted she was harmless. "She just wants company," she said. I tried to convince myself that it was harmless too, but the occurrences only got worse. Lights would flicker whenever I entered a room, and objects I'd placed on the desk or nightstand would move overnight. The phantom touches became more frequent and intrusive. Sometimes a cold finger trailing down my arm, other times a sharp tug on my sleeve. I finally decided to move out after one particularly terrifying night. I woke to find the blanket being pulled off the bed, and when I grabbed it back, I felt resistance, as if someone was on the other end. I bolted upright, turned on the light, and spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, clutching my blanket. When I left, Mrs. Grayson didn't seem surprised. She simply smiled and said, "Mary must have grown attached to you." Even now, years later, I can still feel the occasional phantom brush against my arm, and I wonder if Mary ever really let go. The crying baby. When my husband and I bought an old fixer-upper in a quiet New England town, we thought it was our dream home. It needed work, but it had charm, wooden beams, a cozy attic, and a sprawling backyard. What we didn't expect was the sound of a crying baby that would haunt us every winter. The first time it happened, we had just started renovating. I was upstairs unpacking boxes when I heard it, a faint, muffled cry. I froze, thinking maybe a neighbor's child was outside. But when I looked out the window, the yard was empty, blanketed in fresh snow. The crying continued, soft and rhythmic, seeming to come from the attic. I told my husband, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably wind or the house settling. A few nights later, we both heard it. We were lying in bed when the sound started again, this time louder and more distinct. It echoed through the house, always coming from the same corner of the attic. My husband grabbed a flashlight and we went up to check. The attic was freezing and the beams groaned under our feet, but there was nothing there, just old insulation and a few cobwebs. The crying persisted for weeks. It didn't happen every night, but when it did, it was always the same, soft, distant, and heart-wrenching. Then, during one of our renovation projects, we made a chilling discovery. While tearing down a false wall in the attic, we found an old wooden crib covered in dust. Inside was a yellowed piece of paper with the words, "I'm sorry," scrawled in shaky handwriting. The air around us seemed to drop several degrees, and I felt a weight settle on my chest, like we'd disturbed something that didn't want to be found. After we removed the crib from the house, the crying stopped, but the attic never felt the same. I'd avoid going up there, even during the day, and whenever I passed the door, I felt like something was watching me from the other side. We eventually sold the house, but I can't shake the memory of that crib and the faint sound of a baby's cry echoing through the empty attic. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners hear it too, or if the spirit, has finally found peace. The roadside hitchhiker. It was late one night, and I was driving home after visiting a friend who lived in a rural area. The road was long and empty, with only the occasional flicker of my headlights breaking the darkness. I was about halfway home when I saw her, a woman standing on the side of the road. She looked disoriented, her hair disheveled, and her dress tattered. Instinctively, I slowed down. She didn't wave or move, just stood there staring at the ground. I rolled down the window slightly and asked if she needed help. She didn't answer, but pointed down the road. Her hand was pale, almost translucent, but I assumed she was cold. Reluctantly, I offered her a ride. She climbed into the back seat without a word, her presence sending a chill through the car. I asked her where she needed to go, but she just pointed forward again. Her silence unnerved me, but I decided not to press. As I drove, I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at her face. But when I did, my heart stopped. She wasn't there. The back seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over, my hands shaking. I got out of the car and looked around, but the road was deserted. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Confused and terrified, I got back in the car and drove the rest of the way home as fast as I could. The next day, I told a co-worker about the incident. Her face went pale, and she told me about a local legend, a woman who had died in a car accident on that very stretch of road. People claimed to see her on stormy nights, always looking lost, always pointing forward. They said she never spoke because she was searching for the driver who left her to die. To this day, I avoid that road at night. Whenever I think about her, I feel a cold shiver run down my spine, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone to take her home. The Screaming House. A few years ago, my family rented a house for a weekend getaway in a small, quiet town. It was an older home, charming in a rustic way, with creaky floors and antique furniture. The first night was uneventful, but as we settled in, we started hearing strange noises, soft creaks and whispers that we chalked up to the house's age. The second night, however, was different. We were all asleep when I woke suddenly to a loud, piercing scream. It was distant, but it echoed through the house, sending a chill down my spine. At first, I thought it was one of my siblings, but when I checked their rooms, everyone was sound asleep. I tried to convince myself it was a dream and went back to bed. The next night, the screaming returned. This time, it was louder, more anguished, as if someone was in pain. My dad got up to check outside, thinking it might be an animal, but the yard was empty, the neighborhood silent. As he came back in, we all heard it again, this time closer, as though it was coming from the walls. None of us slept that night, huddled together in the living room with the lights on. The screams didn't stop until just before dawn, fading into faint whispers that lingered in the air. When we left the house the next morning, the caretaker arrived to collect the keys. My dad casually mentioned the noises, and the caretaker's face went pale. He hesitated before saying, "You're not the first to hear it." We never found out what caused the screaming, but I still think about it sometimes, how real it felt, how impossible it was to ignore. I haven't been back to that town since, and I doubt I ever will. Chapter 10. The Possessed Painting. My Aunt Clara was an avid antique collector, always on the hunt for unique and valuable finds. One day, she came home with a large oil painting she'd purchased at an estate sale. The artwork depicted a woman in a green dress, seated by a window, her expression calm, but somehow unsettling. The painting was striking, almost lifelike, and Clara was immediately enamored with it. She hung it in the dining room, where it became a conversation piece for anyone who visited. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Clara loved the painting, and guests often commented on how the woman's eyes seemed to follow them around the room. But soon, small, strange things began to happen. The dining room always felt colder than the rest of the house, no matter how high Clara turned up the heat. Lights would flicker whenever someone spent too much time near the painting, and objects left on the dining table, candles, glasses, or even a bowl of fruit, would be found in different places by morning. Clara tried to explain it away, saying it was just drafts or an old house, but I could tell she was starting to feel uneasy. One night, while I was staying over, I woke up to the sound of soft tapping. It wasn't rhythmic, more like someone lightly drumming their fingers on the table. I crept downstairs, convinced I'd find Clara in the dining room, but the space was empty. The room felt unnaturally cold, and the painting drew my eye. The woman's serene expression seemed different, her lips slightly curled into a smirk, her eyes darker than I remembered. I ran back upstairs, too terrified to tell Clara what I'd seen. Things escalated quickly after that. Clara started noticing the changes herself. One morning, she found the dining chairs rearranged in a circle around the table, though she lived alone. Another time, the lights in the dining room turned on by themselves in the middle of the night. She began to feel watched whenever she was in the room, as if the woman in the painting was silently judging her. The final incident came a week later. Clara woke in the middle of the night to a loud crash from the dining room. She rushed downstairs and found the painting lying face up on the floor. But it wasn't just the fall that startled her. The woman's eyes had been scratched out, as if by sharp claws. Clara was horrified, but when she looked at the wall where it had hung, there were no signs of damage, no explanation for how it had fallen. Terrified, she took the painting to a local antique dealer the next morning, hoping to get rid of it. When the dealer unwrapped it, the scratches were gone, and the woman's calm expression had returned, as though nothing had ever happened. The dealer offered to buy the painting, and Clara didn't hesitate to sell it, desperate to get it out of her house. After the painting was gone, the strange occurrences stopped. Clara finally felt at peace, though she refused to talk about the painting again. To this day, she avoids buying any art that features human figures, and she's warned me never to bring home anything I don't know the history of. Whenever I see an old painting in a shop or museum, I think of that woman in the green dress and wonder if she's still out there, waiting for her next home.